The moment my mother-in-law accused me of lying about my own child, the entire Thanksgiving table went silent. There were 12 of us gathered that Thursday evening in late November at the Whitmore family home in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. The house smelled like roasted turkey sage, stuffing, and cinnamon pie. My 3-year-old son, Noah, was sitting beside me, swinging his little legs under the dining chair, while trying to steal extra cranberry sauce. Everything felt normal, until Linda Whitmore stood up. Linda, my mother-in-law, had always carried herself like the quiet authority in the room. At 58, she had the polished confidence of someone who had spent decades guarding the reputation of the Whitmore name. Her husband, Robert, built one of the largest car dealership groups in eastern Iowa, and Linda had always treated that legacy like something sacred. But that night, she didn't raise a toast. She looked straight at me. "Emily," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the chatter at the table. My husband Daniel sat on my left. His fork froze halfway to his mouth. Linda folded her hands in front of her and spoke loudly enough for every Whitmore cousin, uncle, and sibling to hear. "If you want us to recognize that boy as our grandson," she said, nodding toward Noah, "you'll need to prove he's really Daniel's child." For a moment, I thought I'd misheard her. The room went so quiet, I could hear the old grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Daniel slowly lowered his fork. "Mom, what are you talking about?" But Linda wasn't looking at him anymore. Her eyes stayed locked on me. Then she reached into a small gift bag beside her chair and placed something on the table. A white box, a DNA test kit. "I've already paid for it," she said calmly. "If the results confirm Noah is Daniel's son, we'll gladly include him in the Whitmore Family Trust." She paused, letting the words settle over the room like cold air. But until then, she added, "We can't put his name in the inheritance records." My chest tightened, not because I doubted the truth, but because she had just turned my child into a piece of evidence in front of the entire family. Across the table, Robert Whitmore, my father-in-law, sat quietly with his hands folded. At 61, he had the steady, weathered face of a man who had spent his life building something from nothing. Yet he said nothing, not a single word. Around us, relatives avoided eye contact. A few exchanged uncomfortable glances. Daniel looked between his mother and me, clearly stunned. "Mom, that's ridiculous," he muttered. But Linda didn't respond to him. She was waiting for my answer. For a few seconds, I felt the heat rise in my face. The humiliation was sharp and immediate, like being slapped in front of strangers. Then, Noah tugged on my sleeve. "Mommy, can I have more pie?" His voice snapped me back. I looked down at him, my little boy, with Daniel's dark hair and crooked smile, and something inside me settled. Slowly, I picked up the DNA test box from the table. The room held its breath. "If a test is what you want," I said quietly, "then we'll do the test." Linda's eyebrows lifted slightly, clearly surprised I hadn't argued. Daniel turned toward me. "Emily, you don't have to," but I squeezed his hand. "It's fine," I said, because the truth had never scared me. What I didn't know then was that the results of that test would make someone else at that table turn pale. And it wouldn't be me. Thanksgiving had ended, but the silence from that dinner table followed me home. The next day was Friday, still part of the long holiday weekend, and the Carter house was unusually quiet. Outside, the Iowa sky hung low and gray, the kind of late November cold that made the trees look skeletal against the horizon. Noah sat on the living room floor, building a crooked tower out of plastic blocks, humming to himself. Daniel stood in the kitchen, staring into his coffee mug, like it might explain what had happened the night before. Neither of us had slept much. I leaned against the counter and watched him for a moment before speaking. Did she really plan that ahead of time? Daniel rubbed his forehead. I don't know, but we both did. Linda hadn't simply asked a question in the heat of the moment. She had arrived at Thanksgiving dinner with a DNA test kit already paid for and packaged. That meant she'd been thinking about it for a while, planning it, rehearsing the moment, and choosing the one holiday when the entire Whitmore family would be sitting at the same table. Daniel finally set his mug down. Mom gets intense about the family reputation, he said quietly. I let out a small breath. Intense. That's one word for it. For decades, the Whitmore name had meant something in Cedar Rapids. Robert Whitmore, Daniel's father, had built his first car dealership in the early 80s with a borrowed bank loan and a garage that barely fit 3 vehicles. Over the years, that tiny operation turned into a regional chain that everyone in eastern Iowa recognized. And Linda had guarded that reputation like a security system. Daniel had told me stories before about how she tracked family records, organized genealogy charts, and talked about the Whitmores like they were some kind of old American dynasty, instead of a family that sold trucks and SUVs. Still, none of that had prepared me for what she did at Thanksgiving. Turning to the sink, I picked up the small white box that now sat on our kitchen counter, the DNA test kit. Linda had insisted we take it home after dinner. The box felt oddly heavy in my hands, not because of what was inside, but because of what it represented. You know this is ridiculous, Daniel said suddenly. I know. You don't have to prove anything. I looked toward the living room, where Noah was now carefully placing a toy dinosaur on top of his block tower. The tower collapsed instantly. He laughed, 3 years old, too young to understand what people were already questioning about him. That's not the point, I said softly. Daniel frowned. Then, what is? I set the box back on the counter. If I refuse, I said your mother will spend the rest of her life telling everyone she was right. Daniel didn't argue, because we both knew she would. Linda Whitmore was not the kind of person who quietly let a suspicion go. And there was something else she had said that night that kept echoing in my mind. The family trust, the inheritance, the idea that Noah's place in the Whitmore family could be erased by a single accusation. Daniel leaned back against the counter. I'm sorry, he said, after a long moment. For what? For letting it get that far. I reached over and squeezed his hand. You didn't do it. But deep down, I knew something had shifted inside the Whitmore family. A line had been crossed, and once that kind of accusation entered a family, it didn't disappear easily. Daniel looked down at the box again. So what do we do? I stared at the label printed across the top. A simple company logo, a barcode, a promise of scientific certainty. Finally, I answered. We take the test. Because if Linda Whitmore wanted proof, she was going to get it. What none of us understood yet was that the truth hiding inside that test wasn't just about my son. The first business day after Thanksgiving arrived with a thin layer of frost on the lawns across our neighborhood. Monday morning in Cedar Rapids felt quieter than usual, as if the entire city was still easing back into routine after the holiday weekend. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open, the white DNA test kit still resting beside it like an unwanted guest. Daniel stood near the window, tying his work boots. Neither of us had mentioned his mother yet that morning, but the silence around that topic felt heavy. Finally, I broke it. I'm scheduling the test today. Daniel looked over at me immediately. You're sure? I nodded. If we're going to do this, we do it properly. The kit Linda gave us could technically be mailed in from home, But the more I thought about it over the weekend, the more I realized that wasn't good enough. If this situation ever turned into rumors, or worse, family arguments, I wanted the results to come from a professional lab. No shortcuts, no doubts. I typed the name of a genetic testing clinic in Des Moines, the nearest city with a full diagnostic lab that handled legal-grade paternity tests. It was about 2 hours away, but that distance felt worth it. Daniel walked over and leaned against the chair beside me as I filled out the online appointment form. "You really think Mom's going to drop it after the results?" he asked quietly. I stopped typing for a moment. "No," I said, honestly. Daniel sighed. That's what I thought. His mother had always been stubborn, but the Thanksgiving dinner had revealed something deeper, something colder. Linda Whitmore wasn't just suspicious. She was convinced she was protecting something. The Whitmore family reputation, the family trust, the idea that their name meant something special. I finished entering our information: Daniel Whitmore father, Emily Carter Whitmore mother, Noah Whitmore child. Then I clicked submit. A confirmation page appeared with our appointment time for Wednesday morning. I printed the confirmation and placed the paper on the counter beside the DNA kit. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Noah wandered into the kitchen, dragging his stuffed dinosaur by the tail. "Mommy," he said proudly, holding it up, "T-Rex says good morning." Daniel crouched down and smiled. "Good morning, T-Rex." Watching them together, it was impossible not to notice something that had always been obvious to me. The same dark hair, the same crooked half-smile, the same little crease beside the left eye when they laughed. Even strangers had commented on how much Noah looked like Daniel, which made Linda's accusation feel even more surreal. Daniel must have been thinking the same thing. He stood up slowly and glanced at the DNA kit on the counter. "It's crazy," he muttered. "Anyone with eyes can see he's my kid." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I picked up the printed appointment confirmation. At the bottom of the page was a note from the laboratory explaining how their system worked: standard paternity testing, identity verification, secure digital results, and one additional line that caught my attention: extended genetic matching may identify additional familial relationships when available. I read the sentence twice. It probably didn't mean anything important, just technical language about their database. Still, something about it made me pause. Daniel noticed. "What?" "Nothing," I said, setting the paper down again. It was just a routine explanation. At least, that's what I told myself. But as I looked at the DNA kit sitting on the counter, I couldn't shake the feeling that once this process started, we might end up learning more than Linda Whitmore ever intended. Wednesday morning arrived colder than the rest of the week. Daniel and I left Cedar Rapids before sunrise, the sky still dark, as we drove south on Interstate 380 toward Des Moines. Frost coated the edges of the fields on both sides of the highway, and the windshield wipers scraped softly across the glass. In the back seat, Noah sat bundled in his little winter coat, clutching his stuffed dinosaur. He had no idea where we were going. To him, it was just another car ride with Mom and Dad. The appointment confirmation from the lab sat folded in the cup holder between Daniel and me. Next to it was the small, white DNA test kit Linda had forced into our hands after Thanksgiving dinner. Neither of us had said much during the drive. Daniel finally spoke when we were about 20 minutes from the clinic. "You okay?" I looked out the window at the frozen farmland passing by. "I'm fine." But that wasn't completely true. It wasn't the test itself that bothered me. Science didn't scare me. I worked in a pediatric ward. Tests results and medical reports were part of my daily life. What bothered me was the reason we were here, because someone in Daniel's own family had decided that my word and my child weren't enough. The clinic sat in a quiet medical complex just outside downtown Des Moines, a simple brick building with a blue sign that read Midwest Genetic Diagnostics. Inside, everything smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee. A receptionist greeted us and checked our appointment confirmation before handing us a clipboard with forms to sign. Consent forms, identity verification, chain of custody documentation. This wasn't the casual home test Linda had imagined. This was official. A woman in her 40s, wearing a lab badge, introduced herself as Karen, the genetic technician who would handle the samples. First time doing a paternity test, she asked kindly. Daniel nodded. Karen smiled in a reassuring way that suggested she'd seen families in this situation many times before. It's a quick process, she said. Just a few cheek swabs. She led us into a small clinical room with bright overhead lights and stainless steel counters. Noah climbed onto the chair and swung his feet again, just like he had at the Thanksgiving table. "What are we doing?" he asked. Daniel crouched beside him. "Just a little science test, buddy." Karen began with Daniel. She swabbed the inside of his cheek with a long, sterile cotton stick, sealing the sample into a labeled container. Then she repeated the process with Noah. Noah giggled. "That tickles." Karen laughed softly. "You're doing great." Finally, she took my sample as well, to confirm the maternal side of the report. The entire process took less than 10 minutes. When she finished, Karen placed the sealed containers into a clear evidence bag and attached a barcode label. "These will go straight to the lab," she explained. "Results usually take about 2 weeks. 2 weeks. 14 days of waiting." Daniel nodded and thanked her. Before we left, Karen handed us a printed sheet explaining how to access the results through their secure online portal. I folded the paper and slipped it into my purse. As we walked back through the waiting room, Daniel reached for my hand. "I'm sorry you had to go through this," he said quietly. I squeezed his fingers. "It's almost over." At least, that's what I thought. Outside, the cold air hit my face as we stepped into the parking lot. Noah ran ahead a few steps, pretending his dinosaur could fly. I glanced back once more at the clinic building. Somewhere inside those walls, 3 tiny DNA samples now held the answer Linda Whitmore had demanded. But the strange feeling I'd had since reading the lab instructions on Monday hadn't gone away. Because sometimes, when you ask science a question, you don't always control which answers come back. The first week after the test passed more slowly than I expected. By the following Monday, winter had fully settled over Cedar Rapids. The mornings were darker, the air sharper, and every time I checked my email, I half expected to see a notification from Midwest Genetic Diagnostics waiting for me. But nothing came. Life, meanwhile, continued as if the question hanging over our family didn't exist. I returned to my shifts at the pediatric unit at St. Luke's Hospital, where sick children and worried parents filled every hour of my day. When you work around families dealing with real medical crises, it puts strange perspective on something like a DNA test. But the moment I walked through our front door each evening, the tension returned. Daniel tried to act normal. He played with Noah on the living room floor. He helped with bedtime stories. He kept telling me the same thing. This will be over soon. Still, something had changed. It wasn't just the waiting. It was what was happening around us while we waited. Linda Whitmore had apparently decided that silence was not her style. On Wednesday evening, Daniel's phone rang while we were eating dinner. He glanced at the screen and sighed. "Mom," he answered anyway. I couldn't hear Linda's voice clearly, but Daniel's expression shifted almost immediately. "Mom, we already did the test," he said. A pause. "No, the results aren't back yet." Another pause. Then his jaw tightened. "Mom, that's not fair." When he finally hung up, he looked exhausted. "What did she say?" I asked. Daniel rubbed his face. "She's been talking to the family." I felt my stomach drop. Talking about what? Daniel hesitated. Then he repeated the words quietly. "She told Aunt Marlene that she's just trying to clean up the family tree." For a moment, the room felt colder. Clean up the family tree, like my child was some kind of stain. I looked toward the living room, where Noah was pushing toy trucks across the carpet. He was making engine noises, completely absorbed in his own little world. He had no idea his grandmother was questioning whether he even belonged to this family. Daniel noticed the look on my face. "She shouldn't have said that," he said quickly. "I told her to stop talking about it." "Did she listen?" He didn't answer, which was answer enough. Over the next few days, the situation only grew worse. Daniel's cousin texted him, asking if everything was okay. An old family friend made a strange comment about rumors spreading around town. Linda hadn't just questioned Noah privately. She had turned the accusation into a story people were repeating. By the second week, something inside me shifted. Until then, I had been trying to keep the peace, trying to be patient, trying to believe the results alone would settle everything. But sitting at the kitchen table one night, while Noah slept upstairs, I realized something important. Even if the test proved what I already knew, Linda Whitmore would never apologize quietly. People like her didn't do that. Daniel sat across from me, scrolling through his phone. What he asked when he saw my expression. I closed my laptop slowly. "When the results come back," I said, "we're not just emailing them to your mom." He looked confused. "What do you mean?" I held his gaze. "I mean everyone who heard her accusations deserves to hear the truth too." Daniel didn't answer right away, but after a long moment, he nodded. Because we both understood something now. The DNA test wasn't just about proving Noah belonged to this family. It was about something bigger. And once the truth arrived, there would be no going back to silence. The notification arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. I was finishing a shift at St. Luke's Hospital when my phone vibrated in the pocket of my scrubs. At first, I ignored it. Pediatric wards rarely gave you a quiet moment, and I had learned not to check personal messages until my patients were settled. But when I finally stepped into the staff break room around 3 o'clock, I glanced down at the screen. There it was. Midwest Genetic Diagnostics. Your results are ready. For a few seconds, I just stared at the email. 2 weeks of waiting had come down to a single notification. My hands felt strangely cold as I opened the secure portal on my phone. The login page asked for the case number printed on the sheet Karen had given us at the clinic. I typed it carefully. Then I waited while the page loaded. When the report appeared, the first line was impossible to miss. Probability of paternity 99.99%. I exhaled slowly. Not because I had doubted the truth, but because seeing the confirmation still felt like something lifting off my chest. Daniel was Noah's father, exactly as it had always been. I scrolled further down the report. Standard genetic markers, verification codes, laboratory certification. Everything was clear and official. For a moment, I imagined Linda's face when she saw it. The rumors would stop. The whispers would end. But as I continued reading, another section of the report caught my eye. Extended family matching analysis. I frowned slightly. This must have been the feature mentioned in the instructions from the lab. Curious, I opened the section. At first, the screen filled with a table of technical genetic data I didn't fully understand. But one line stood out immediately, a highlighted note from the laboratory system. Expected paternal relative comparison, inconclusive or inconsistent. I blinked. That didn't make sense. I read it again. The report didn't explain further. It simply flagged the result as something that could occur when extended family DNA profiles were unavailable in their system, which I assumed was normal. After all, we hadn't submitted anyone else's DNA. Still, the wording felt oddly specific, inconsistent. I locked my phone and slipped it back into my pocket. At that moment, I decided not to think about it. The important part was already clear. Noah was Daniel's son. That was the truth Linda had demanded, and now I had it in writing. When I got home that evening, Daniel was in the living room building a train track on the carpet with Noah. I held up my phone. The results came. He stood up immediately, and I handed him the phone. He read the first line and let out a quiet breath. I knew it. I watched the tension leave his shoulders. For the first time in weeks, he looked relieved. "Noah's definitely my kid," he said, half laughing. "Of course he is." Daniel shook his head. "I can't wait to see Mom's reaction." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I thought about everything Linda had said over the past 2 weeks. The rumors, the family tree comment, the way she had turned my son into a question mark in front of everyone. Then I remembered the decision I had made at the kitchen table days earlier. When the truth came out, everyone who heard the accusation would hear the answer, too. Daniel noticed my silence. "What are you thinking?" I met his eyes. "I'm thinking we shouldn't send the results privately." He tilted his head. "What do you mean? I mean, your mother didn't accuse me in private." I took the phone back and looked again at the report on the screen. So she doesn't get the truth in private either. Daniel didn't argue, because by then he understood something had changed. The results had finally arrived, and the moment Linda Whitmore had been waiting for was about to begin. Wednesday morning came colder than the day before. The wind rattled the bare branches outside our kitchen window while I stood at the counter making coffee. Noah was still asleep upstairs, and Daniel had already left early for the dealership office he managed on the south side of Cedar Rapids. For the first time in weeks, the house felt calm. The DNA results sat safely inside my email inbox, the report confirming what I had always known. Daniel was Noah's father. I had read the document 3 times the night before, making sure every line was clear before we shared it with anyone else. But there was still that one small detail in the report that lingered in my mind. The line about extended family comparison being inconsistent. I had tried to ignore it. It probably meant nothing. Still, curiosity finally pushed me to make a phone call. The laboratory number was printed at the bottom of the report. When the receptionist answered, I explained that we had received our results and had one question about a note in the extended analysis section. She transferred me to someone in the genetics department. A man introduced himself as Dr. Alan Pierce, one of the lab supervisors. His voice was calm and professional. "How can I help you, Mrs. Whitmore?" I pulled the report up on my laptop. "There's a note in the extended matching section," I said. "It says the paternal relative comparison was inconsistent. I just wanted to make sure that doesn't affect the paternity result." Dr. Pierce answered immediately. "Oh no," he said. "The paternity result is completely definitive. Your husband is the biological father of the child." I exhaled. That's what I thought. There was a brief pause on the line. Then Dr. Pierce continued. "The additional note you're referring to is unrelated to the child's paternity. It's simply a system flag. A flag for what? Our lab software compares certain genetic markers against broader family structures when enough data is available, he explained. In your case, the algorithm detected something unusual in the paternal lineage markers. My fingers tightened around the phone. What kind of unusual? Well, he said carefully, genetically speaking, your husband's profile does not align with the expected inheritance pattern for the individual listed as his father in the documentation. For a moment, I didn't understand what he meant. Then the meaning settled in. You're saying, I began slowly. Dr. Pierce finished the sentence for me. The markers strongly suggest that Robert Whitmore is not your husband's biological father. The kitchen suddenly felt very quiet. I stared out the window at the gray Iowa sky. That can't be right. It doesn't affect your child's test in any way, he reassured me quickly. But from a genetic standpoint, the paternal lineage in your husband's record appears inconsistent. Inconsistent. The same word I had read the night before. I thanked him and ended the call. For a long time, I just stood there holding the phone. Because now the situation was no longer simple. Linda Whitmore had spent 2 weeks telling people she needed to clean up the family tree. She had publicly questioned my child's place in that tree. But according to the lab, the roots of that tree weren't what she thought they were. Daniel walked through the front door an hour later, having forgotten a folder for work. He stopped when he saw my expression. What happened? I looked down at the printed report on the kitchen counter. Then, back at him. There's something in the results we need to talk about, I said quietly, because suddenly the DNA test wasn't just about proving my son belonged to the Whitmore family. It had uncovered a secret that might tear that family apart. And I had no idea what would happen once the truth reached the wrong ears. Wednesday morning came colder than the day before. The wind rattled the bare branches outside our kitchen window while I stood at the counter making coffee. Noah was still asleep upstairs, and Daniel had already left early for the dealership office he managed on the south side of Cedar Rapids. For the first time in weeks, the house felt calm. The DNA results sat safely inside my email inbox, the report confirming what I had always known. Daniel was Noah's father. I had read the document 3 times the night before, making sure every line was clear before we shared it with anyone else. But there was still that one small detail in the report that lingered in my mind. The line about extended family comparison being inconsistent. I had tried to ignore it. It probably meant nothing. Still, curiosity finally pushed me to make a phone call. The laboratory number was printed at the bottom of the report. When the receptionist answered, I explained that we had received our results and had one question about a note in the extended analysis section. She transferred me to someone in the genetics department. A man introduced himself as Dr. Alan Pierce, one of the lab supervisors. His voice was calm and professional. How can I help you, Mrs. Whitmore? I pulled the report up on my laptop. There's a note in the extended matching section, I said. It says the paternal relative comparison was inconsistent. I just wanted to make sure that doesn't affect the paternity result. Dr. Pierce answered immediately. Oh no, he said. The paternity result is completely definitive. Your husband is the biological father of the child. I exhaled. That's what I thought. There was a brief pause on the line. Then Dr. Pierce continued. The additional note you're referring to is unrelated to the child's paternity. It's simply a system flag. A flag for what? Our lab software compares certain genetic markers against broader family structures when enough data is available, he explained. In your case, The algorithm detected something unusual in the paternal lineage markers. My fingers tightened around the phone. What kind of unusual? Well, he said carefully. Genetically speaking, your husband's profile does not align with the expected inheritance pattern for the individual listed as his father in the documentation. For a moment, I didn't understand what he meant. Then the meaning settled in. You're saying, I began slowly. Dr. Pierce finished the sentence for me. The markers strongly suggest that Robert Whitmore is not your husband's biological father. The kitchen suddenly felt very quiet. I stared out the window at the gray Iowa sky. That can't be right. It doesn't affect your child's test in any way, he reassured me quickly. But from a genetic standpoint, the paternal lineage in your husband's record appears inconsistent. Inconsistent. The same word I had read the night before. I thanked him and ended the call. For a long time, I just stood there holding the phone. Because now, the situation was no longer simple. Linda Whitmore had spent 2 weeks telling people she needed to clean up the family tree. She had publicly questioned my child's place in that tree. But according to the lab, the roots of that tree weren't what she thought they were. Daniel walked through the front door an hour later, having forgotten a folder for work. He stopped when he saw my expression. What happened? I looked down at the printed report on the kitchen counter, then back at him. There's something in the results we need to talk about, I said quietly, because suddenly the DNA test wasn't just about proving my son belonged to the Whitmore family. It had uncovered a secret that might tear that family apart. And I had no idea what would happen once the truth reached the wrong ears. By Friday evening, the Whitmore house was full again. Linda had insisted on it. Daniel received the message that morning while we were finishing breakfast. His mother wanted the family together that weekend, so the DNA results could be read properly. According to her, it was the only fair way to settle what she had started at Thanksgiving. The message had been sent to nearly everyone in the family. Aunts, cousins, Robert, even Daniel's cousin Mark, who usually drove in from Iowa City for major family events. In other words, the same audience who had heard Linda's accusation. Daniel looked uneasy when he read the message. She really wants this to be public. I folded the printed DNA report and slid it back into its envelope. Yes, I said quietly. She does. But now the situation was different from what Linda expected. Because she believed the evening would end with an apology from me. She had no idea what the full report actually contained. We arrived at the Whitmore house just after 6. The same dining room where the Thanksgiving dinner had taken place was already filled with familiar faces. Conversations were quiet and slightly uncomfortable, like everyone knew they were about to witness something awkward. Robert Whitmore stood near the fireplace, speaking to Daniel's uncle. He nodded politely when we walked in, but his expression was unreadable. Linda, on the other hand, looked completely confident. She stood at the head of the dining table with her arms folded like a judge preparing to hear a verdict. Good, she said when she saw us. Everyone's here. Noah stayed close to me holding my hand. Daniel rested his palm lightly on my back. Linda glanced down at the envelope in my hands. I assume you brought the results. I did. Her lips curved slightly. Well then, she said, turning toward the room. Let's finally clear this up. Chairs shifted. Conversations stopped. Daniel and I moved toward the center of the room. For a brief moment, I felt the same tightness in my chest I had felt on Thanksgiving night. The same circle of watching eyes, the same quiet judgment. But this time, I wasn't the one being cornered. Linda looked directly at me. Go ahead, she said. Read it. Her confidence was almost impressive. She truly believed the document would expose me. I opened the envelope and removed the printed report. The first page was simple, clear, undeniable. Probability of paternity. I read calmly, 99.99%. A ripple of murmurs moved through the room. Daniel was standing beside me now. "Noah is my son," he said firmly. Several relatives nodded. Linda's expression froze for half a second. But then she forced a smile. "Well," she said quickly, "that's good to hear." Her voice had changed slightly, sharper, controlled, as if she was already trying to move past the moment. "Then, I suppose, that settles the matter," she added. "We can all—" "Not quite," I said. The room went still again. Linda frowned. "What do you mean I turned the page of the report?" "There's one more section." Daniel glanced at me, already knowing what was coming. Linda crossed her arms. "What section?" I held the report so everyone could see the heading printed across the page. Extended Family Genetic Analysis. "This part wasn't something we requested," I said. "But the lab includes it automatically." Robert's voice cut in quietly from across the room. "What does it say?" I looked up. For a moment, our eyes met. Then I read the line the lab had flagged. "The report indicates that the genetic markers in Daniel's profile do not match the expected paternal lineage." Silence filled the dining room. Linda's smile vanished. Robert straightened slowly near the fireplace. Daniel took a slow breath beside me, because in that moment, everyone in the room understood the same thing: the DNA test. Linda demanded to prove my son didn't belong to the Whitmore family, had just raised a far more dangerous question about the Whitmore family itself. And the night was far from over. No one moved after I read the line out loud. The Whitmore dining room, which had already felt tense when we arrived, now seemed to shrink around us. Even Noah sensed the change. He pressed against my side, still holding my hand, his stuffed dinosaur tucked under his arm. Linda was the first to speak. "That's absurd," she said, too quickly. Her voice came out sharp, almost brittle. "There must be some mistake in the report." Robert took 2 slow steps away from the fireplace. "What mistake?" he asked. At 61, he had always carried himself like a man who believed in order, routine, and facts. I had seen that look before, when he talked business with Daniel, calm, measured, not easily rattled. But now, there was something else under it, something hard. Linda lifted her chin. "These tests aren't perfect," Daniel answered before I could. "The paternity result was perfect enough for you when you thought it would humiliate Emily. That landed exactly where it needed to." Several relatives lowered their eyes. No one had forgotten why we were all standing there in the first place. Robert turned toward me. "Is that everything the lab said?" I hesitated only a second. "It's what the report says," I answered. "And I called the lab this morning to make sure the note didn't affect Noah's results. They told me it didn't. They also said the paternal markers in Daniel's profile were inconsistent with the man listed as his father." The room went silent all over again. Linda stared at me, as if I had broken some unspoken rule simply by repeating the truth. "You called the lab?" she asked. "Yes." Her face changed then. Not shock exactly. Fear. Robert noticed it too. Slowly he turned to his wife. Linda looked around the room as though searching for someone to rescue her. But this wasn't Thanksgiving. The crowd that had once watched me in silence was now watching her. "Linda," Robert said, and this time his voice was lower. "Answer the question." She folded and unfolded her hands. "It was a long time ago." No one breathed. Daniel's face went blank beside me. Robert didn't blink. "What was a long time ago?" Linda's voice dropped to almost a whisper. Before our wedding. That was all it took. The words seemed to move across the room like a cold draft. One of Daniel's aunts sat down abruptly. His cousin Mark muttered, "Oh my God," under his breath. Daniel stood absolutely still, as if his body hadn't caught up with what his mind had just heard. Robert's expression didn't explode. It cracked. That was worse, because a shouting man can still cling to anger. A quiet man who suddenly understands he has been lied to for 30 years has nowhere to hide from it. "You let me raise him," he said. Linda's eyes filled, but no tears fell. "I didn't know for sure." The sentence hit the room like another blow. Not didn't remember, not made a mistake. Didn't know for sure. Daniel finally spoke, but his voice barely sounded like his own. "You stood there on Thanksgiving," he said, "and questioned my son's blood while hiding this." Linda looked at him, and for the first time all evening, she had no authority left. No polished certainty. No family reputation speech. Just a woman standing in the middle of her own wreckage. Robert stepped back from her, as if distance itself had become necessary. Nobody mentioned the family trust now. Nobody talked about the Whitmore name. Because the thing Linda had tried to protect, by humiliating me, had collapsed in front of everyone. And even with the truth finally out, I didn't feel relief yet. Only the strange, heavy stillness that comes when karma arrives so completely that no one in the room is prepared for what happens next. The next morning, the Whitmore family didn't call. No one asked us to come back. No one tried to explain away what had happened by the fireplace. After 30 years of protecting a polished version of her family, Linda had finally watched that version collapse in a single evening. And this time, there was no rumor she could spread to outrun the truth. Over the next few weeks, the consequences unfolded quietly, but unmistakably. Robert moved out of the Whitmore house and into a furnished apartment near the river on the west side of Cedar Rapids. He told Daniel he needed space, not just from Linda, but from the entire life he had built around assumptions that were no longer real. The family trust issue disappeared almost overnight. No one mentioned Noah's place in it again. No one questioned whether he belonged. That part, at least, was settled. For the first time since Thanksgiving, my son's name was no longer hanging in the air like a challenge to be answered. It was simply his name again. Daniel changed too, not all at once. Grief doesn't work that way, but the anger he carried after that night slowly turned into clarity. He stopped answering his mother's daily calls. He stopped trying to manage everyone else's feelings before his own. One evening, after Noah had fallen asleep, he sat across from me at our kitchen table and said the words I think I had needed most. "You were right to stand your ground," he said, "and I should have protected you sooner. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Sometimes honesty is the real beginning of healing." By late February, Daniel accepted an operations job with a dealership group in Madison, Wisconsin. It was a smaller market, a quieter life, and far enough from Cedar Rapids to give us air. I transferred my nursing license and found a position at a pediatric clinic on the east side of the city. We packed our house in boxes, folded Noah's tiny winter clothes into suitcases, and left Iowa before the first thaw fully arrived. Noah adjusted faster than either of us. He liked the new apartment. He liked the park down the street. He liked that his stuffed dinosaur had a place by the window in his new room. Children know how to accept peace when adults finally make it possible. By April, the snow was gone from Madison. The sidewalks were wet with spring rain, and small green shoots were pushing up through the grass in the neighborhood park. One Saturday morning, I stood beside Daniel while Noah ran toward the swings, laughing hard enough to make strangers smile. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel slipped his hand into mine. Behind us was Cedar Rapids, the Whitmore house, the white DNA test kit, the inheritance threat, the humiliation at Thanksgiving. In the silence that followed, all of it felt farther away now, not erased, but no longer in control of us. Linda had lost the authority she used like a weapon. Robert had to reckon with the truth she buried, and the family name she tried so hard to defend had been damaged, not by me, but by her own cruelty. That was the justice of it. Not revenge shouted across a room, not victory rubbed in anyone's face. Just the truth, arriving in its own time, and leaving everyone to live with what they had done. As I watched Noah pump his legs higher on the swing, I understood something I hadn't fully seen before. Family is not protected by suspicion. It is protected by love, honesty, and the willingness to treat people with dignity before they have to fight to earn it. And in the end, that was what we carried with us into spring. If you've ever lived through a moment where truth changed a family forever, I'd love to hear what justice or healing looked like for you. If this story stayed with you, leave a like, subscribe, and follow along for the next one. There's always another story about what happens when people mistake control for love.